Self-awareness is a powerful thing, particularly when it comes to video games. It's more important than you might think for a game to know exactly what it is, or more importantly, what players want it to be, because knowing exactly what to aim for helps developers make a good game, whereas including features that don't belong generally leads to a confusing mess. Sometimes though, these stray ideas find their way into the finished game regardless. When this happens, it's practically impossible for players to miss because they stick out like a big old bag of severed thumbs. They really are that noticeable. Sometimes it's a case of tonally dissonant missions or minigames, and other times it's a mechanic that simply doesn't gel with anything else going on around it. There are even rare occasions where a whole game feels out of place in its own franchise. One thing that all of the following games have in common though is that they tried something different, but it didn't necessarily land. With that in mind, I'm Ben from TripleJump, and here are 10 times video games experienced an identity crisis. Number 10. Spyro Year of the Dragon. Back in the late 1990s, Spyro the Dragon captured the hearts of a generation. The year 2000 saw the release of the franchise's third game, subtitled Year of the Dragon, continuing the rich platforming traditions of its predecessors, and much like the second game, Year of the Dragon features a multitude of minigames dotted around its various worlds. While there are several contenders across the franchise that could have feasibly made this list, it's Year of the Dragon's skateboarding levels that really take the metaphorical cake. In these unexpected segments, Spyro steps through a portal and inexplicably finds a skate park. Then, at the behest of a talking cheetah, the young purple dragon hops on a board and starts carving up the tarmac. With the Tony Hawk games an ongoing cultural phenomenon at the time, it seems the segments are a nod to Neversoft skateboarding games, but that doesn't make them any less jarring. Seeing Spyro break out some unexpected and unlikely skateboarding skills at the drop of a hat is such a huge departure from the fantastical platforming and magical enemies of the franchise. Ultimately, this makes Year of the Dragon's skateboarding levels feel like a pretty obvious identity crisis, even if they are genuinely fun. Number 9. Shadow the Hedgehog. Despite being one of the most iconic video game characters of all time, Sonic the Hedgehog had a bit of a rough time of it in the 2000s. In an attempt to broaden the franchise's appeal, Sega opted to make Shadow the Hedgehog, a spin-off game based on the character introduced in Sonic Adventure 2. As Shadow was reasonably popular, this wasn't necessarily a bad move, except, of course, for the fact that the entire game was horrendously misguided. Taking the colourful platforming franchise and making it dark, edgy, and full of guns, Shadow the Hedgehog is as much a third-person shooter as it is a platformer. In terms of tone, it's a huge departure from what makes Sonic great, trying way too hard to deliver an earnest story filled with needless angst. It also features mild profanity, which is honestly baffling for a game supposedly designed to revitalize the family-friendly franchise. It's clear that Shadow the Hedgehog was supposed to be something new, but it really wasn't what the franchise needed. By doing away with almost every recognizable element of the Sonic games and embracing a darkness that literally no one asked for, Shadow the Hedgehog is basically just a big steaming pile of identity crisis. Number 8. Call of Duty Infinite Warfare. The Call of Duty franchise has long been unstoppable in the gaming industry, but that doesn't mean it hasn't ever lost its way. Though its missteps have generally been few and far between, there is one Call of Duty title that really didn't seem to know what it was: 2016's Infinite Warfare. Though the franchise's previous games make use of either modern or historical settings, Infinite Warfare looks ahead. Set in the year 2187, it puts players in the shoes of a soldier in a futuristic war fought using mechs, spaceships, and soldiers with powerful exoskeletons. It also has Jon Snow, for some reason. Infinite Warfare essentially takes COD's winning formula and tinkers with all of its best parts. Replacing the series' realism with Hollywood actors and unnecessary sci-fi may have technically started with the previous title, Advanced Warfare, but the 2016 game fully embraces its futuristic setting. Taking players out into the solar system was, quite literally, too far. It may not have been a bad game in its own right, but it wasn't what most players wanted from the franchise. Interestingly, Infinite Warfare was released alongside a remastered version of 2007's Call of Duty 4, with the latter proving infinitely, more popular. Apparently getting the message, the sci-fi bells and whistles were quickly abandoned for subsequent games. Number 7. Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. The Assassin's Creed franchise has had its fair share of ups and downs, but Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag remains one of the series' most beloved titles. Taking its action to the high seas was a departure from previous games' more urban environments, but it was ultimately a welcome one. After all, who wouldn't want to step into the rum-soaked boots of a pirate assassin? It sounds amazing. Black Flag captures the pirate experience in emphatic fashion, letting players partake in sea battles and hunt treasures across the Caribbean. Unfortunately, this epic sun-soaked adventure is broken up by some of the most tediously mundane mundane segments ever unnecessarily slotted into a video game. Much like previous Assassin's Creed games, Black Flag features a modern-day story. This time, however, instead of controlling the semi-interesting Desmond Miles, players take on the role of an undercover office grunt. Cue a few mind-numbing conversations at various desks and an aimless wander around the office trying to look busy. An average Friday then. The implication is that Ubisoft thought players would rather leave the pirate action behind to play Corporate Drone Sim 2013. Trying to put even the barest emphasis on the franchise's modern-day elements was a clear misunderstanding of what players enjoy about Assassin's Creed, and that's why Black Flag's office segments feel like the worst identity crisis imaginable. Number 6. Tony Hawk's American Wasteland. At one time, the popularity of the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater franchise was utterly monumental. From the late 1990s through to the early 2000s, the series was a legitimate cultural phenomenon. Then began its rather sudden decline, which arguably started with Tony Hawk's American Wasteland. Objectively speaking, American Wasteland wasn't considered a bad game, but it was certainly a confused one. While spinning its decidedly anti-establishment story, American Wasteland introduces two mechanics that seem particularly out of place, as well as the totally radical skateboarding action players had come to expect from Tonky Hank titles. American Wasteland also weirdly includes rideable BMXs and, even weirder, parkour. Although the addition of the BMX mechanics isn't too far removed from the series' extreme sports ethos, remember that the franchise is literally named after a celebrity famous for a different sport. Throwing parkour into the mix just makes American Wasteland feel even more surreal because it serves no genuine purpose. From these unlikely additions, it became clear that the Tony Hawk games were out of fresh ideas and were just going to keep adding new mechanics until something landed. It spelled the beginning of the end for the franchise, an end that rode in on a BMX and then ripped a totally sweet backflip for absolutely no reason whatsoever. Number 5. Red Dead Redemption. For the most part, Red Dead Redemption is probably the last game you'd think of in relation to the words identity crisis. A sprawling open-world western telling the violent yet touching tale of former outlaw John Marston, Red Dead Redemption possesses a pretty singular clarity of purpose. It's obviously the result of a very specific vision, and that's part of what makes it so great. The Undead Nightmare DLC, on the other hand, transforming Marston's historically grounded and emotionally driven story into something entirely different, Undead Nightmare takes Red Dead Redemption's western atmosphere and fills it with zombies. Without making any significant changes to gameplay, Undead Nightmare turned a western into a survival horror game. Perhaps the most surprising part, though, is just how well it works. Undead Nightmare is undeniably brilliant, but that doesn't stop it from feeling just a little too out there. Mashing up western action and survival horror was a gamble on Rockstar's part that ultimately seemed rather pointless, really, if only because it was so unexpected. It's thoroughly different from the earnest Red Dead Redemption on a thematic and tonal level, which makes it every bit as confusing as it is entertaining. Unfortunately, no amount of cowboy zombies and fiery steeds can conceal that Undead Nightmare really doesn't fit with Red Dead Redemption's serious mood. Number 4. Assassin's Creed Revelations. 2 picks from the Assassin's Creed franchise. Oh boy, this series really must have no idea what it is. As much as the franchise's modern-day segments are always a little jarring, there's one particular part of Assassin's Creed Revelations that's far more out of place. The game mostly consists of running around 16th century Constantinople as assassin Ezio Auditore, climbing tall buildings and dispatching Templars with extreme prejudice. Standard Assassin's Creed stuff, basically. Then comes Revelations' Den Defense missions, which couldn't have been a bigger departure from Assassin's Creed's usual action. In the process of taking the city from the Templars, Ezio riles them a little and they fight back. This triggers a Den Defense mission in which the Templars attack an assassin hideout with the player forced to hold the invaders off. For some unknown reason, Ubisoft thought the best way to achieve this was with a tower defense style minigame. To go from open world action to real-time strategy is weird enough, but it's a clear rip-off of an established format shoehorned into a game that really didn't need it. How exactly this ever seemed like a good or even a necessary idea is truly baffling, because it just isn't at all in line with anything else the franchise had offered before, or since, for that matter. Number 3. Soulcalibur 3. Fighting games really aren't too hard to get right. After all, the general idea is quite simple. You have a roster of characters and they fight one another. However, Soulcalibur 3 apparently wasn't content with that, which is why it included an extra game mode called Chronicles of the Sword. Chronicles of the Sword tasks players with making a custom hero, then taking them on a campaign across various battlefields to defend strongholds. Naturally, this is achieved with standard fighting game mechanics, but between fights, players could enjoy a little taste of real-time strategy. For a fighting game, Chronicles of the Sword seems ambitious, but Soulcalibur 3 was released in 2005. Considering the scope and depth of other games released in that era, the fighting game's foray into real-time strategy was generally quite disappointing. However, that really only distracts from the real issue. Why exactly was a series of fighting games branching out in such an unexpected way? Maybe it's because Soulcalibur has always been a little more high concept than other fighting games, or maybe it was just an attempt to set the series apart. Either way, Soulcalibur 3's Chronicles of the Sword mode felt like the strangest attempt possible to reinvent the franchise. In case you were curious, no, it didn't find its way into Soulcalibur 4. Number 2. Peter Shilton's Handball Maradona. Back in the early days of video games, the sky really was the limit. Well, that and the huge technical limitations of early consoles, but still, imagination ran rampant. Sometimes the sheer brilliance of developers' ideas literally reshaped the industry, and other times we ended up with games like Peter Shilton's Handball Maradona. Not only does its name sound like my dad randomly shouting every football word he knows, but it's a game that's deeply flawed in a conceptual sense. For non-sports people, Peter Shilton was once a famous goalkeeper, and Maradona was an Argentinian player who infamously scored a goal using his hands. That's against the rules, apparently. The name of the game clearly refers to the notorious incident, but it doesn't really have anything to do with it. It's basically just a goalkeeping simulator with the player controlling Shilton as he waits around in goal to make occasional saves. Even in the late 80s, there was an obvious market for sports games featuring real players. However, one thing that Peter Shilton's Handball Maradona overlooked was that people actually wanted to play the whole match, not just try to save a few goals. Also, the game didn't even feature Maradona or handball, so the title belies just how confused Peter Shilton's Handball Maradona is about its own identity. Number 1. Mortal Kombat Armageddon. The Mortal Kombat games are known for their brutal violence, but 2006's Mortal Kombat Armageddon offers something else. As well as limb removal, blood draining, and magic lightning, Armageddon features a bonus game called Motor Combat. Honestly, who wouldn't have expected a kart racer bundled in with one of the most violent fighting games ever to exist? Surely it was exactly what Mortal Kombat fans have been waiting for since the franchise's conception. No? It wasn't? Oh, in all fairness, Motor Combat doesn't really play too badly. It's hardly on par with Mario Kart or even Crash Team Racing, but it's still far better than it has any right to be. With that said, its very existence is quite confusing because it's so obviously out of place within both the game and the franchise. In actuality, Motor Combat exists as part of a rich tradition of weird mini-games and features included in the Mortal Kombat series. Even so, its presence in Armageddon essentially undermines the game's more serious aspects, with the tonal divide between modes being practically impossible to overcome. Motor Kombat might be hilarious and unexpectedly fun, but it still feels like a living, breathing identity crisis to us. Mortal Kombat Armageddon? More like Mortal Kombat Carmageddon? Got him.